Today's episode discusses sensitive topics related to mental health and suicide. If you or someone you know is struggling, we encourage you to reach out for help. Remember, you're not alone, and resources are available to support you. If you're in the United States, you can contact the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 988. For those outside the U.S., please contact your local mental health services or helplines. We hope this conversation sheds light on the importance of mental health awareness and encourages open dialogue within all of our communities.
In America, depending on the year, men account for 75 to 80% of the deaths by suicide. So we are struggling and we do need the help. Personally, I feel way more comfortable being vulnerable and sharing with women. Always have, and I still do, despite this whole journey that I've been on. And I think that is very telling and representative of, what's going on. But in my experience, I have been very impressed by and empowered by the response and desire for men to have these conversations and have this space.
I'm Meg Carney, an outdoor and environmental journalist, and this is the Outdoor Minimalist Podcast. Thank you for joining us so that together we can create a better outdoor space as we recreate. In episode 158 of the Outdoor Minimalist Podcast, we are engaging in a powerful conversation about mental health in our outdoor communities with Drew Petersen, the creator of Feel It All, a film that explores the intersection of mental health struggles and ultramarathon running. We'll hear about the personal journey behind the film, challenges facing mountain communities, and the critical role outdoor athletes can play in changing the stigma around mental health. Drew Petersen is a professional skier and passionate ultrarunner who is on a mission to change our culture surrounding mental health. He blends his athletic adventures, ranging from skiing peaks in the backcountry to running 100 miles, with his storytelling as a writer, filmmaker, and speaker in order to bring others along for the ride and to advocate for what he cares most about. As a skier, he's graced magazine covers and starred in dozens of award-winning ski films. His writing has appeared in Outside Magazine, Powder Magazine, Ski Magazine, and more. In 2022, Drew produced, co-directed, and starred in Ups and Downs, a mold-breaking film that mirrors the mountains and valleys of ski touring with his own mental health journey. And his newest film, Feel It All, chronicles running the Leadville 100, one of the most iconic 100-mile ultramarathons in the world, through the peaks he has skied surrounding the course and the deep mental health goal that drives him to pursue both audacious athletic goals and a full life. So thank you for joining me on the Outdoor Minimalist Podcast today, Drew. I am excited to pivot a little bit on the topics on the show and discuss a little bit more about mental health. But before we get into that, I'm going to ask you my classic question, which is, how did you become interested in outdoor recreation and how does it fit into your life now?
I think that's a good question for this conversation because I think for me, it's really an evolution of my answer to that question. But how I got started with outdoor recreation is I was pretty much born into it. I was born and raised here in Summit County, Colorado, right in the middle of the Rocky Mountains. And so I often say that I was born on a pair of skis. My parents were big skiers, and it's a huge part of why they decided to raise me and my brother here. So I started skiing when I was 1.5 years old. And otherwise, when we were little kids, we just played outside a ton. And our house basically backed up to the national forest. So that was our babysitter of sorts. The rule when we were little kids was we were allowed to go into the woods alone if we brought our dog with us. So we would just go play. And I think in a sense, like that's what all outdoor recreation maybe should be or stems from, is just playing. And I'd like to think that over time I've evolved and kind of like recentered somewhat to that mentality and excitement of just playing outside. My relationship with outdoor recreation now is honestly, I'm having just about the most fun I've ever had with my forms of movement outside, which are mostly skiing in the winter and trail running in the summer. But any flavor of getting outside, breathing fresh air, I'm enjoying. And that evolution comes from a career as a professional skier. And originally, and for much of my life, certainly my adult life, building my identity and my self-worth around skiing and really evolving from that to now have a healthier, more independent relationship with sport, in that it's just one part of my identity and it doesn't always have to be professional, but it can always be fun.
Yeah, and that evolution seems to be a really big part of your new film, Feel It All. And that's kind of how we originally connected. And so, how does your personal journey fit into that? What led you to want to create this film? And what experiences kind of support that narrative or are built into the film's narrative?
Yeah, I like that framing because I do think that that relationship with sport is a lot of the underlying story and message and evolution within Feel It All. And so I think in some senses, like the reason that I made this film, the reason that I do things the way that I do, and my mental health advocacy is rooted in, largely skiing and trail running, is because those are common threads and passions that can be an entry point and a way to start conversation and welcome people in. And so I use those sports to welcome people into a conversation and into stories that go much deeper. And so Feel It All is my personal mental health journey told through the lens of my goal to run the Leadville 100, one of the most iconic 100-mile ultra marathons right here in my home mountains in Colorado. And that goal, I like to think of it as less a movie that's about running 100 miles and more a movie about the strength, resilience, and growth found within the goal itself, and how that interacts with my life journey and mental health journey overall. So we use the narrative arc of the race to tell the story of my mental health journey. And the motivation for making that film kind of came in a few different avenues. One, I've always really wanted to make a film combining skiing and running. Um, and this felt like the kind of perfect opportunity to finally get to follow through on that. And then uh really like the larger motivation and like factor of like, hey, I'm gonna do this, is really within myself, knowing that I have this deep volition and belief and like song that I need to sing, and I need to use it to help people. And knowing that I have that within me has guided really the past 4 or so years of my life. And it's what is my North Star when I wake up in the morning. It was the North Star for making this film. The third part of why I made this film is my previous film, Ups and Downs, was also an expose of my personal mental health journey told through the lens of ski touring. um, when I made that film, I knew that it was going to help people. It had that same, deep volition, but uh, I did not understand the degree or the impact of which it could have. And so I wanted to make Feel It All with more intention and mission behind creating that impact of cultural change around mental health and suicide. And so those kind of combined factors were what made me kind of um, you know follow through and work on this for the past couple of years.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I do really love how like creative forms of media can really help push those types of conversations. And through your personal experience and then your experience through your filmmaking, why or how do you think mental health awareness or like the conversation around mental health maybe has become more important in the outdoor industry? I don't know if that question really makes sense. I like had two questions in my head and then they became one, but if that makes sense to you, you can answer it.
Yeah, well, let's just talk about like the evolution of mental health and culture within our community. Is like,
Yeah.
I For me personally, for any of us, we only have our own lens through which to see the world, right? So my lens right now is very mental health focused. So I see the conversations that are happening and it's a lot of progress. But then at the same time, if I take a step back and look at beyond my perspective, these conversations are growing. And they're growing out of a lot of wonderful, motivation and helping people and shifting the future. But they're also coming out of necessity and even desperation. Uh, the the reality of the time that we're living in as a society is that we are in a mental health and suicide crisis. And within the outdoor community, we are definitely in a mental health and suicide crisis. And it's difficult to, parse that out statistically or quantitatively, because we have to cross-reference data from the Outdoor Industry Association and the CDC and all sorts of stuff like that. But personally, like I live in the American West and I have lived in mountain towns all across the American West. And we are really ground zero for that mental health and suicide crisis. 7 of the 10 Rocky Mountain states consistently rank in the top 10 highest suicide rates in the country. And that's largely driven by high suicide rates in mountain towns and mountain communities that, people like us are kind of centered in consistently. Like the counties that I call home here in Colorado, like Summit County, Eagle County, Pitkin County, where Aspen is, San Miguel County, where Telluride is. Those are often some of the highest suicide rates, not just in the state, but in the country. And that's driven by communities in mountain towns that are largely outdoor, outdoor recreation communities. I think like when you asked that, you asked about the outdoor industry, and personally, I focus most of my efforts on the outdoor community. And I think it's personally, I like to differentiate between community and industry because the industry is part of the community, but I don't think that focusing on the outdoor industry is representative of what's happening as a community as a whole. I think that maybe there's some steps forward in the outdoor industry, particularly when we're looking at different nonprofits doing fantastic work, and I would classify that as falling within the industry, but really like their impact is being felt in the community, and I think the changes that I'm seeing and experiencing and that I'm proud of for our community are really coming from communities that don't just need these conversations around mental health and suicide to be elevated. They really want to elevate these conversations around mental health and suicide. And I think that desire is what really is driving not just the elevation of conversation and breaking down stigma, but I do think that desire for conversation and real change is what is needed to shift culture. And it's happening and it's working and it's going to keep working.
Adventuring plans on your calendar? Remember to grab your Lava Linens travel towel on your way out the door. Founded by a mother-daughter team, Lava Linens crafts durable, luxurious travel towels as a more sustainable and better performing alternative to microfiber and cotton towels. Powered by flax, hemp, and Tencel, they're designed to be by your side for years to come. Use the code OutdoorMinimalist for 15% off your next order. Okay, so I guess this is kind of like a two-part question to kind of follow up on what you were just talking about. But with those mountain communities, I think that might be surprising to some people. I know it was kind of to me because it's not necessarily the place that I would think of to be struggling a lot with mental health, especially like in rural areas and things like that. But what is kind of, or in your experience, what do you think is a big factor in that mental health crisis in those smaller communities? And what do you think is helping motivate them to want to now have these conversations to kind of move out of that, hopefully?
Yeah, there's a lot going on. So we could talk basically forever, and you can probably hear in my voice that I light up because I'm super passionate about all of this. So first, the suicide rates all across America are higher in rural areas than urban areas, but that is not nearly enough to explain what is happening in mountain towns or in mountain communities. And so I think like largely at the root of it is this dissonance with living in an amazing place, living in paradise, having an idyllic lifestyle, with also struggling. And I think that belief and centered view around living in paradise and living the dream can often invalidate people's experience who are struggling. And those struggles are very real. First, struggle is a shared part of the human experience. So we're all going through it. Everybody's going to struggle at some point in their lifetimes. And most people are going to struggle with mental health at some point in their lifetimes too. But if we don't feel like that is a valid part of the experience of living in these places or in these communities, like that's the root of a lot of this problem. Um, a large part of like what I kind of boil this down to is like the culture that I grew up in. And I think that the culture that I'm still a part of and I'm trying to change is within the ski community specifically. There's a ski hard, party hard, stay hard culture in that we send it on the mountain and we tie up a lot of our self-worth and identity in what we can do recreationally, whether that's skiing, mountain biking, whatever. And then party hard, there is a large, cultural element focused around alcohol and substance use in these communities. Like I grew up believing that everything you did in the outdoors had to be finished with a beer on the tailgate. And then the stay hard component of that is to never show weakness and to build our identities and again, our self-worth based around our strength, largely around what we do in the outdoors. And that is like, a very basic societal norm and shift that we need to show that strength isn't just pushing through. It can be, but strength can also be vulnerability, asking for help, and wanting to change as an individual or as a community. So there's a lot going on in there. There's also seasonal and transient communities, economic struggles and disparity, the housing crisis that we see in mountain towns. Like there's so many different factors at play, a lack of behavioral health care, but really like all of those factors, when you kind of boil them down, are like very representative of like the mountain towns, mountain communities, outdoor communities, and they're kind of a microcosm of what we're seeing in society in America as a whole. And so when I say like when I said like the outdoor industry or like a lot of the people doing great work are like, for example, like some of the small nonprofits doing great work on the ground, I think like the biggest success that I'm seeing on that realm is there's a lot of great nonprofits like here in my hometown, Building Hope Summit County, with their therapy scholarship programs, making therapy far more accessible in our communities. And that's a great start. But to change all of this overall, we have to change, I believe, culture and the systems at play. So the cultural element is, largely what I focus on and what we're focusing on today, elevating that conversation in a way that invites people in and uses sport or art or storytelling in a way to, really shift things and make people feel less alone, make people feel valid in their experiences. And then on the systemic side, that's shifting our healthcare systems. And the therapy scholarships are an example of one of the most effective ways that we're navigating the current healthcare system to improve it, especially in these rural and mountain communities. Um, I think like we often talk like, even I talk like when we are in a mental health and suicide crisis, but I do think it's important to kind of note like these are things that we're chipping away at, and it's worthwhile to keep going because there's so much work to do.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. And like you said, there's so many other factors that can play into those things. So those are kind of like maybe some of the more overarching, like easier to identify ones right now. And as a professional athlete, it's nice to see you use your platform in this way to hopefully change some of that stigma around mental health and continue this conversation. But what are some steps that individuals in these communities, no matter where they are located, can actually address and hopefully prevent suicide, especially in these high risk locations that you're talking about?
Yeah. Um, On a community level, it's supporting organizations like your local mental health nonprofits or supporting your local suicide and crisis hotline call center. And also voting people into small local elections who are going to support things like funding for that. That's, at the baseline of what you can do on a community level. In kind of like, less tangible way on a community level is build community, create friendships and connection and intergenerational relationships and friendships and connection based on getting outside and doing healthy things, but also not totally centered on recreation or sport as an identity. Like create that culture within your community yourself. And then on an individual level or a community level, I always say, or a societal level, frankly, I always say the solution starts with talking about it. So if we're trying to change the culture of our communities, we need to be talking about mental health. We need to be talking about suicide. We need to be honest about where we're at as a community, and we need to be creating the space for other people, like I said, to know that they're valid in their experiences. And then on an individual level, is I always encourage people to trust their human intuition. Like we are innately very emotionally intelligent beings, and we are the human species for good reason because we've evolved to be able to feel things and to connect with each other. We need that human connection on a genuine level. And so with that is, not just building community, but then when people are struggling, creating the space to listen and for them to share what they're going through. Um, one of the hardest parts of all of this, and I think one of the parts that's the scariest for people, and something that I get questions on a lot through creating these films or live events, is like, what do you do like to get through to somebody who you think is struggling, you're not sure exactly what's going on? And really, like, it is starting with that like mentality of creating the space for them to share. So vulnerability begets vulnerability. The first step of vulnerability can be very small. It can be very simple. It could be sharing this podcast with them, or it could be sharing one of my films with them, just to say, hey, I'm a friend that cares about these things. We can talk about these things. But then really it's asking questions and being okay with sitting in silence while your friend shares what they're going through or hesitates, and, you know, creating that environment that they feel safe in. And then really, like, the goal here is to prevent suicide. Like, I don't know when or how or if it's realistic to really have zero suicides in our community, zero deaths by suicide and zero deaths by suicide in America. But why not aim for that? And on an individual level, that really starts with asking directly. So statistically and scientifically, research shows that asking directly about suicide doesn't put the idea in that person's mind and doesn't make them more likely to act on it or more likely to have intense suicidal thoughts. So we need to ask each other directly if we're worried about each other and trust that human intuition. If you are worried, then it's worth asking, and ask directly. So ask, are you thinking about suicide? Those 5 words have the power to save infinite lives. And that is a part of a framework called QPR, which stands for question, persuade, refer. And that's a training for everyday people who want to be able to prevent suicide in their communities. It'd be awesome if we all went and took that training, but that's probably not realistic. But if you just know those initials of QPR, that is enough to empower you to save other people's lives. Because question is asking directly, are you thinking about suicide? Persuade is persuading them to not act on those thoughts if they answer yes in the immediate future. The immediate future could just be the next 30 minutes, or it could be the next 10 days. And then refer is refer that person to professional help that is adequate and supportive of their situation. That could literally be driving them to the emergency room if that is the level of crisis they're in. It could be sitting with them as they call the suicide and crisis hotline. And that worker on the other side of the hotline number helps them find the right resources for them. Or it could be being an accountability partner for them, finding help and finding a therapist for the first time in their lives. So really, like what all of that comes down to and what that all boils down to, again, is that the solution starts with talking about it. And if we normalize this conversation, then we also normalize getting help and improving all of this.
Yeah, I love that framework. I'll be sure to share some resources in the show notes as well so people can access that and learn more about how to engage in those conversations in maybe a constructive way. And one thing that in my personal experience that I have like witnessed in my general circle of friends and people that I have interacted with in the outdoor communities as well is that a lot of my like more feminine presenting friends will be a lot more open to vulnerability. And that often is societal conditioning, right? And so as a man, and someone that would be like more masculine presenting, how have you embraced vulnerability and helped your fellow men in the community do the same?
Thanks for asking that. As a woman, like asking to create that space for men is awesome and is very appreciated. In America, depending on the year, men account for 75 to 80% of the deaths by suicide. So we are struggling and we do need the help. Personally, I feel way more comfortable being vulnerable and sharing with women. Always have, and I still do, despite this whole journey that I've been on. And I think that is very telling and representative of, what's going on. Um, but in my experience, I have been very impressed by and empowered by the response and desire for men to have these conversations and have this space. I remember the first time I shared one of my films live, the first person to come up to me afterwards was a 300-pound man with tattoo sleeves on both arms, a huge beard, and he asked if he could give me a hug. And I gave him a hug and he broke down crying in my arms. And that being the first time I ever shared one of these films live has carried with me and been uh been a through line through all of this work is how badly men want this conversation and need the space to be vulnerable and be themselves and be able to share. And I don't have the answers of how we do that, but I go to this local men's group where oftentimes like what we talk about each week is like what it means to be a man. And we're in a time when we need to redefine what real masculinity looks like, what healthy masculinity looks like. And vulnerability is a huge part of that. Like there's nothing stronger and more badass if we're going to fit it under a definition of masculinity than being vulnerable, creating the space for others, helping others, and using your position in society, like for me as a white cis hetero male, to create that space to lift other people up. Like that's, to play into traditional masculinity stereotypes. Like that's manly as fuck, and that's what we need to do.
Absolutely, I agree. Um, awesome. Yeah, I appreciate your vulnerability during this discussion and through all of your content, your films, sharing your journey. I think that is really impactful to like see another person that maybe wouldn't traditionally be sharing in that way, be so open about it. And so if you were to give listeners one key takeaway, I know that's kind of hard to pick one, but from your journey and your films, what would that be?
Yeah. For listeners, you did send me these questions ahead of time, and I read this one, and I get this question a lot. I get this question about what's the one takeaway from the film or from a talk or, from my story, and I don't have a canned answer. And I think that in itself is an answer. As human beings, we all feel very unique because we are, and that's what makes us so beautiful and so wonderful. But it can also leave us feeling terminally unique and believing that nobody could possibly be going through similar experiences to us. For me personally, I spent more than the first 2 decades of my life feeling completely alone on this planet. I've struggled with suicidal thoughts since I was a little kid, and I didn't think there was anybody else who could possibly have those thoughts going through their head and who could possibly be experiencing that much pain. I believed that when I was 9 years old, and I believed that when I was 25 years old. And I'm in a very lucky and privileged position that I've put myself in, and I have learned how far from normal these struggles are. They are quite the opposite of what I used to believe. They are so normal. All of this is normal. All of it is part of the human experience. And within that, there's beauty and there's value and there's support if we open up to each other. And for me, I only started to believe that all of this is normal because of my experience sharing all of this publicly. I have connected with thousands of people face to face and thousands of people online. And honestly, like I might have to change those numbers soon to say that I've connected face to face with tens of thousands of people and that I've received tens of thousands of messages. And so many of those messages and so many of those people say, thank you for sharing. It helps me feel less alone. And that is my takeaway. And that is what I want to share with other people, is that for every person who I've made feel less alone, there are millions more, billions more on the other side who also have felt alone and don't need to feel alone within that.
It all comes back to community is kind of a lot of what I'm hearing is like you've kind of built a community around your message and journey in film, and hopefully are inspiring others to build those communities where we can be open and create space for each other, especially in the outdoors. And so if listeners want to learn more about you and your work, your films, how is the best way to do that?
The number one thing is to go watch my new film, Feel It All. It's all over the internet, so I hope it's easy to find. Otherwise, I've been doing a bad job. But if you go to my website, drew-petersen.com/feelitall, it all lives right there. The film's right there. The events calendar is right there with a bunch of screenings that we've got coming up. And I'm going to keep those in-person screenings going on indefinitely into the future because I believe in the power of in-person experiences to form connection and to create impact. And then the best place to kind of follow along would be signing up for my email newsletter right there on my website, or following me on Instagram at DrewPeterSki. And that is let's call it a healthy mix of skiing, running, mental health, and unhinged humor.
Amazing. I'll be sure to share the links to all of those resources in the show notes. But with that, thank you so much, Drew, for sharing your story.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks for having me on and for using your podcast and your platform and your voice to affect all this change. I appreciate you.
Thanks for listening. And if you like what you hear, let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book, on YouTube, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter at theoutdoorminimalist.com. For even more updates, other educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with the shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.